Hello, how's everybody doing? Today and this week we're going to look more at language contact. We did start looking at it a little bit, but we're going to go more in depth. And if you remember from another episode, we talked a little bit about talkin, which is a pidgin language that you talk. If you remember this example that I gave you, the chuteria, which is a couple miles down the street from me at Arizona Mills Mall, you see the contact between languages, between Spanish and English. The shoe is English, of course, and then teria is Spanish. So some of you Spanish speakers are probably cringing right now, but I think it's awesome. Except there's no accent. Languages in context, so we talked about levels of borrowing, types of borrowing, so it could be lexicon, words or phrases. It could also be structural, so phonological, leisure, the je, morphological, so the affixes, for example, the suffix alumni, I, instead of alumnus, and then ita, casita, which we pronounce in English as casita. So we didn't take the phonological, but we did take the morphological. And then the syntactical, word order, noun adjective, which is really not as common, but could be. Okay. Then we also talked about borrowed words, what kinds of words are generally borrowed, body parts, familial relationships, and environment are not generally borrowed, and grammatical function words are not generally borrowed, yeah? But then we also looked at some that are borrowed. We looked at certain words depending on the language, yeah? I even mentioned, for example, Japanese. You have tsunami and karaoke, but also we have emoji, which is a big one these days. That's just an example. So languages in contact, when two languages interact, two people who speak two different languages interact, certain things are possible. You could actually just borrow vocabulary. You can have a language shift where one language or the other has is dominant. So you have superstratum, which is the dominant language, and substratum, which is the less dominant. You could have strata influence, there again, the strata, stratum. See, those are not English suffixes. Interesting. And creation of, and then from the strata influence, you could also have pidgin, which turns into Creole, or mixed languages. Okay. So that's kind of an overview. So what are the outcomes of language contact? This is just a different way to talk to you about it, so that if that way didn't make so much sense, let's look at this. So we have language X meets language Y. You could have outcomes would be here on the right. Lingua franca, which is X and Y make Z. No, just kidding. You have language X and language Y, so you could have a totally separate language, which is the lingua franca, such as English, used to communicate for government, for law, right? For business, trade. You could also have X and Y mixed together, and form a pidgin. So X plus Y, right? XY. Another possible outcome is code switching. So using some of one language and some of another language, or using all of one language for a period of time and then all of another language. So X and Y. And just switching between those. So that would mean that people in that certain community would need to have knowledge, would need to be fluent in both. Yeah. X and Y. Highly intensive language contact. Here we have different levels of languages having contact with each other and mixing. So we have Pidgin, we have Creole, and then we have bilingual mixed, which is like an intertwined. So Pidgin develops for trading purposes. Pidgin is the very beginning of forming a new language. It generally has very few grammar structures, or goes back and forth from two or three different languages with the structures until that's more established. There's also no written form, and there's no native speakers, because native speaker of language X and native speaker of language Y need to communicate. So there's no native speaker of language Z, I guess it would be language Z, XY. So it's only spoken. So from Pidgin, then we go to Creole, which follows Pidgin, right? It is a language used by a community. It has a grammar structure and native speakers, which is very important. And it takes on a written form. So that's Creole, and I'm going to give you a few examples. So we have Pidgin, Creole, and then bilingual mixed, the intertwined. This is not so common, but here's one example to kind of explain it more. It combines an intertwined, a bilingual mix, combines aspects of one language with aspects of another language. So in Ecuador, there's a region called Imbabura, Cotopaxi. Okay. So there are Spanish speakers, and then there are Quechua speakers, and they need to communicate. Native language for some of them is Quechua. And it's called media lengua. So here, I got this from Wikipedia. But it's a really good, thorough explanation, just kind of covering the surface, but thorough in looking at the linguistic aspects. So they're all different words for the media lengua, different terms. Excuse me. It's a mixed language, Spanish vocabulary, and Quechua grammar. There are different languages in South America, different native languages. So one is Quechua, one is Quechua. This one is Quechua. So the Quechua kept the grammar, the Spanish put in the vocabulary. Interesting. The morphology. So the root words come from Spanish, but then the Quechua puts on the endings, the phonotactics. So it's really interesting if you're into that kind of thing, the mixing. So that is an example of bilingual mixed. So it's not, it almost maintains certain aspects of each language so that it's more evenly mixed, okay? Outcomes of language contact, we have language death, which means there are no native speakers left of a language. Language shift, one language replaces another, and that is because of unequal prestige. So one language has more prestige than the other. There are many different factors for why that would happen. Language maintenance, that is maintaining both languages. Bilingual society or multilingual society. Your book talked about diglossia, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Then we have Pidgin, which is the very beginning of creating another language. Pidgin goes to Creole. Then you also would have a lingua franca, which is if you have language X and language Y come together, they do not speak the same languages, so they adopt another one as the lingua franca, like English. And global languages, which is almost like lingua franca, but languages that are more commonly used, okay? There was another one that was not on this particular list, language convergence, when two languages become more similar to each other. Okay, so those are all outcomes of language contact. We're going to move on to borrowings into English so that you guys can see how much English has gotten from other languages. And the history is all explained, but I think that this is really important, that 38.3% of words in English come from other sources instead of the Germanic. You have 31% French, almost 2% Scandinavian, almost 3% Latin. Yeah. And then there are a few others that make it to 38.3%. One that I really found interesting was the food and drink terms, and also anything else that's ingested. So you take what you want from that. Whenever there's contact with another culture, then that culture would generally take on that terminology. So here in Arizona, I gave you the example of casita. A casita is a very good example because we haven't taken the phonological aspect, but we have taken the lexicon, the terminology, and we even left the morphological aspect there, which is ita. So, kind of interesting. Okay, but back to food and drink. So Spanish, cigar, tequila, marijuana, German, Frankfurter, and pretzels, others as well. Hindi, chutney, basmati rice, love basmati. Yiddish, bagel and lox, yummy. Spelled yogurt wrong, sorry. Turkish is yogurt. Japanese, probably not the yogurt we have here in the U.S. Like, they have, it's not sweet, but anyway. Japanese, sake, sushi. Russian, vodka. I don't think I said that right. Irish, whiskey. And so we have quite a few drink items here. And then Arabic, kebab. So all of these are from different languages, and we use it every day. Oh, can I make you a shrimp kebab, right? Let's go out for sushi tonight. That's a great idea. Let's go out for sushi. I love sushi. Okay. I'm going to give you a little bit more of an overview of what I mentioned earlier, which was Pidgin and Creole. So the main reason that Pidgin languages are created is trade. There's also talk in the book about plantation, and they focus more on for the plantations and the slaves coming and none of the slaves many don't speak the same languages or dialects, that becomes a Creole, but it starts out as a pidgin. So the slaves would need to communicate, and also so they would have like a secret language, communicate pidgin with each other, and then there would also be, maybe we would call it like a lingua franca with the owners. So all of this, and this is, I'm not even going into the sociocultural aspects of this. I'm just looking at it objectively from how, as to how and why these are formed. So you have trade, people need to trade. So let's start with pre-pidgin jargon. Inconsistent grammar, we have to start somewhere, so let's find a common word for banana, right? Then you go to prototypical pidgins. Banana, I'm not good at this, but I'm trying. Banana, need, you have, right? So it's limited to certain situations. Then it expands because people say, oh, well, we can use this for trade. Like, we are using this language and somehow communicating and able to trade with each other. So it kind of just explodes into more like a largical, lexical resource and structural, and they start building the language. And it's just comes naturally. Yeah. So then you go to Creole. I talked to you some about the plantation. So you have the, let's go back. You have the pre-pidgin going to the prototypical pidgin, going to expanded pidgin, and then all of a sudden, like, it becomes that somebody's born and that's their first language. So that's a Creole. It's called nativization, and it would be your first language, L1, right? So it takes time to go through this process, but then there will be children born who maybe their parents speak a different language to them, but if the parents are together and maybe they didn't have the same L1, they speak the pidgin to each other. And then when the baby's born and starts speaking, they are speaking this Creole because the baby, that's the first language of the baby. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I just wanted to show you a few examples because I love this topic. They call Hawaiian Creole is called pidgin, but it's not a pidgin. It has become a Creole. Yeah. So that's why I marked that out. Let's look at a few examples, or maybe I'll go through all of them because they're really cool. How's it? Junk. Brada. Otherwise known as bruh, right? Sista. Kapu. I think that's from keep out. Kap. Ooh, maybe not. Kaden. Yeah, we have gotten this K out of that, right? Because texting is almost a Creole, is it not? It is pidgin. You can see when you text, if you don't have to write out every word and put periods and commas and make sure you're spelling correctly, it's kind of like a pidgin. Okay, bruh. Like beef, you want to fight. I don't know about that. Broke them out, the best food. Broke them out. Let me find one more. Let's see on this side. AU. AU fucka. Exactly what it sounds like. That's awesome. Okay. Is it wrong for people to speak this way? If you see the reason behind why people have begun speaking this way, do you have a different concept of what's happening now? And can you be less judgmental of people who speak a dialect, a pidgin, a different language, whatever word you want to use to describe it? The last topic that we're going to look at is societal multilingualism. This is when a community of speakers share the languages and use them in everyday life. They use both. So, it's generally this is related to diglossia because it depends on the situation what language you're going to use. Why did this occur, or why does it occur? Historical factors, people getting together, military conquest, political marriages, colonization, immigration. Immigration's a big topic right now. Contemporary factors, I would say that would be contemporary as well. Present day immigration, language promotion, internationalization. So it'll be interesting to see what languages are pushed during the World Cup, which is coming up soon. The soccer, because so many countries compete. I was thinking about it. Code switching is using two or more languages or dialects within a single utterance or a single conversation. I want to tell you that I strongly believe that people who code switch, not intermittently use a word or two, but if they're code switching back and forth, that means that they have a good command of both languages that they're using. So here's some reasons. The mood of the speaker. To clarify, right? Let me look at, I'm sorry, I can't see this. Amplify, show identity. So there are a lot of different reasons why we code switch. Maybe it's just to show off. So many people look down on this, but if you look at a bigger picture, you can see that actually you have to be pretty smart. And then I mentioned diglossia. Different languages or dialects are used for different functions. So here are a couple examples. In Paraguay, the high, which would be like the language of education. I'm not sure why they say high and low, but I think that puts too much of a value judgment on it. But so Spanish would be used like for education, and then Guarani, which is a native language, is used at home, in social situations, And then also in African countries, I don't know a lot about this, but I do know that in education, many countries in Africa use either English or French. And then there are so many different dialects, languages, that each pocket group has a language, and then that group needs to communicate with the other group. So instead of like creating their own pidgin, they actually use a lingua franca. But when they're with their kids or their loved ones from the same community, they use a local variety. And then there's another one that's like a little bit higher. It's in between. I guess they would call it medium. And that would be like a standard language versus a low-level local variety. I hope that makes sense. I don't really like to use that terminology because I think that it's value based on who decided that. Let's end on a positive note. Language is power. Language is life and the instrument of culture. The instrument of domination and liberation. Think about what that has to do with language contact. Have a good week. Thanks.